Hey guys, today we're just going to go over some strategies that you can use on your Punnett Square take-home quiz. Please keep in mind that this take-home quiz will be graded for accuracy, so it's important that you spend some time on it, and it's essentially just a practice test to get you prepared for your 9 weeks test later on this week. So we're going to go over some strategies of how to accomplish that today. Now, one thing I won't be doing is I won't be giving you the answers for each of these, but I will be giving you some tips and tricks to help you along the way. So if you get stuck, you can flip to the slide for that question. Number 1, in chickens, the trait for yellow legs is dominant over the trait for white legs. So we see some important information in that first sentence already, that yellow is dominant to white. And it also says that a breeder wants to cross his chickens to have offspring with an equal ratio of chicks with yellow to white legs. So once again, if we know for sure that yellow is dominant, then we can be expecting 2 different genotypes to create that dominant phenotype. We can either have homozygous dominant, meaning the same dominant alleles, or we can have heterozygous, meaning different alleles, but we still have a dominant allele to express that phenotype. So we have to have at least 2 of those because there's 4 squares in a Punnett square. So we're looking for either 1 of each, maybe 2 of different ones. So then we also have to have 2 white legs, which are the recessive trait. And in order for it to show the recessive trait, our genotype cannot be paired with the dominant allele because the dominant allele will boss it over and only show the dominant phenotype. So we have to have homozygous recessive alleles here. So when you're looking at your answer choices over here, you're looking for an equal ratio of these things to these. So we want just as many genotypes that will allow for yellow that will allow for white. So for instance, you could go over and use this strategy of saying, okay, this is homozygous dominant, so we know that this is going to be yellow. Homozygous dominant, we know it's going to be yellow. And you can go through each of those boxes and find out which one is a 2-to-2 or 1-to-1 ratio, or you could solve the percentages for each one, percentage of yellow, percentage of white. Number 2, in the swallowtail butterfly, the allele for black wings is dominant over the allele for yellow wings. A cross between 2 black-winged butterflies produces a yellow-winged butterfly. So looking at this, it says once again that the black wings are dominant over the allele for yellow wings, which is recessive. And it says that we are producing a yellow-winged butterfly. And it says what is the correct genotype and phenotype of the offspring. So we're not even worried about the parents really right now because we have the information that we need already just from looking at the child. So we know for sure that the offspring has yellow wings, which is a recessive trait, which means that even if it had only 1 dominant allele, it would still show a dominant trait. So we know that its genotype or its allele pairing has to be homozygous recessive, which in this case they're wanting us to use B, so we can use the letter B instead. So looking at that, what phenotype does that match with? Is that black or yellow? We know that the genotype is homozygous recessive. We know that the phenotype is yellow. So which of these charts says that the genotype is homozygous recessive and the phenotype is yellow wings? Number 3, in a plant, the trait for purple leaves is dominant over the trait for recessive leaves or green leaves. So what cross will result in the maximum number of offspring with the purple leaf trait? The way that I would approach this one, you can do one of 2 things. The first thing is you can kind of check through your alleles for each of these and say, okay, this one doesn't have a dominant allele, so it's not going to have as much of an outcome for the dominant allele later on. Or an even better way to do this, it might take a little bit more time, but it would be extremely effective, is you could say, okay, here is my Punnett square for the answer choice A. Here's my Punnett square for the answer choice B. And I would just go through and I would set each of those up for A, B, C, and D. So let's look at A together. we have homozygous recessive, and then we have heterozygous. And remember that when we're using Punnett squares, we bring one allele down and one allele over, one allele down and one allele over, one down and one over, one down and one over. So over here, this is a 50% chance of having purple and a 50% chance of having green. So what we'll do is we'll do this for each of the answer choices A, B, C, and D, and then you will compare this outcome right here. And whichever one has the maximum amount of purple leaf traits, that's the parent pairing that you will choose for your answer. Number 4, in guinea pigs, the allele for black eyes is dominant to the allele for red eyes. So I know that black eyes is dominant and red eyes are recessive. And then it also says that a male guinea pig that is heterozygous for eye color is crossed with a female guinea pig that has red eyes. So that tells us a couple of things right off the bat. We know for sure that the male is heterozygous, and hetero means different, so we can write that at the top. Remember, hetero equals different, and homo means same. So if he is heterozygous, that means that the male has two different alleles, one dominant, one recessive, and that makes his eyes black because he's still expressing that dominant phenotype right here. Now the female, it says that she has red eyes, and we know that red eyes are a recessive trait. So if she's expressing the red eye trait, then that means that she can't have any dominant alleles to mess that up. So she has to have two recessive alleles in order to be able to express those red eyes. So we're looking for one of these Punnett squares that has a heterozygous pairing for the dad and a homozygous recessive pairing for the mom, which once again they use B's, so you'll have homozygous recessive B's and heterozygous B's for the male. So you'll have to figure out which of those matches these two things. So remember that when you're setting up a Punnett square, you can put your parent alleles on either side. So it could look something like that, or it could be the opposite way like that with all that stuff filled in the center. Make sure the stuff in the center is correct too. Number 5, in pigs, the allele for erect ears is dominant over the allele for floppy ears. So we have two different kinds of ears here in pigs. So we have erect ears, which means the ears stand up, and then we have floppy ears, which are where the ears are, well, floppy. So dominant is erect, so we know that this is going to be our dominant allele, and our recessive allele are floppy ears. So it says that a parent has erect ears, but its offspring has floppy ears. So we want to figure out some facts about the parent and offspring before we go into what our true statement could be. So we know that the parent has erect ears, which means he has to have at least one dominant allele. So he's either going to be homozygous dominant, where he has two dominant alleles, or he can be heterozygous, because he'll still show those erect ears. Now the offspring, it says, has floppy ears. And if he is expressing that recessive phenotype, then he has to have a recessive genotype as well in order to express that recessive trait. So looking at that, can he be the offspring of someone who is homozygous dominant? No, because he would only be able to send over a dominant allele, and that wouldn't make this possible. So we know that the parent in that case is heterozygous for sure. So now we have to figure out which of these statements is true. Now be very careful with this, because this question is kind of tricky because it switches gears from talking about the offspring to talking about the parent. So just make sure that when you're reading this, you're looking at the information for either the offspring over here or the parent over here. Number 6, the trait for dark colored hair is dominant. So dark color is dominant over the trait for light color hair. Which statement correctly represents an example of a phenotype and a genotype for these traits? So looking at this, if we were to build a key, so a key being what exactly is going on with our dominant, we said that our dominant is dark and our recessive is light. And so if we were to look at our genotypes, we know we have three different kinds of genotypes. We have homozygous dominant, we have heterozygous, and we have homozygous recessive. So we have to look at each of these things and figure out which phenotype is going to be expressed. Will homozygous dominant show a dominant or a recessive phenotype? Of course, it's going to show dominant phenotype because that's the only kind of trait that it has. Our heterozygous has both dominant and recessive alleles, and because it has at least one dominant allele, it's still going to show the dominant trait. Our recessive alleles, if we have two recessive alleles, it's going to show a recessive phenotype of homozygous recessive for light hair. So once we have this key written out, that's when we can go to our answer choices down here, and it's saying the genotypes blank and blank are going to result in whatever phenotype. So you're just going to make sure that these two genotypes are matching the dark color phenotype, and that this genotype is matching the light phenotype in these answer choices below. Number 7. A student reads that some pea plants have violet flowers while some have white flowers. Breeding a pea plant with violet flowers with a pea plant with white flowers produces offspring, some of which have violet flowers while others have white flowers. How do the offspring express the gene for flower color from the parent plants? So this is just a question about inheritance, and it's wanting to know, is it that the random expression of one gene obtained from a single parent plant? Or is it the expression of one gene obtained from each parent plant? The expression of a gene that is inherited by any cell of the offspring? The random expression of a gene that is more numerous in the cells of the offsprings? So we have to think in sexual reproduction, where do we get that information? And we know that we get it from mom, and we know that we get it from dad. And so we're getting one allele from each gene, one from mom, one from dad, to make that zygote. And when we have that zygote, that's what's going to determine the expression of that trait there. Number 8. In pea plants, the allele for purple flowers is dominant to the allele for white flowers. What percentage of offspring is expected to be purebred from the following cross? So you're going to draw out a Punnett square for this one. So we draw our box, and then we're going to plug in these pair alleles. So we have heterozygous, and we're actually going to change these to B's because B's are a lot easier to see as far as the uppercase and lowercase. So we have two heterozygous parents. So we're bringing one down, one over, one over, one down, one down, one over, one down, one over. And so it's asking you what percentage is expected to be purebred. And remember, we have purebred means homozygous. And then we have hybrid means heterozygous. So keep that in mind while you were answering those questions. All right, so number 9 says, how is it possible for an organism to have a recessive phenotype for a trait such as white flower in pea plants? So in order to express a recessive phenotype, we have to have a homozygous recessive genotype, because even if we had one dominant allele, that dominant allele would completely mask the recessive phenotype. So we know it can't even be heterozygous, it has to be homozygous recessive, right? So looking at that, we say, how can that happen exactly? And we know that with sexual reproduction, we get one of those alleles from mom and one of those alleles from dad. So take that into account, the whole sexual reproduction and fertilization process to create that diploid zygote. Number 10. In a plant species, the allele for dark green leaves is dominant over the allele for light green leaves. A plant with a genotype of a dominant and recessive allele or heterozygous is crossed with a homozygous recessive plant. So it says, what percentage of the offspring are expected to be hybrid for the leaf color trait? So the first thing that we have to do is we have to set up our Punnett square. You're going to plug in your heterozygous allele pairings on one side, your homozygous allele pairings on the other side. Once you get all your information, you're going to count up the number of hybrid organisms. And just like we said earlier, we said hybrid equals hetero. So we're looking for the percent of heterozygous offspring. Number 11. A mother has curly hair while a father has straight hair. So we know that mom has curly, dad has straight. 3 of their 4 children have curly hair when 1 has straight. So 3 have curly and 1 has straight. Which statement best explains the reason that 3 children have curly hair and only 1 child has straight hair? So this brings us back to, if we look at our ratio here, we have a 3-to-1 ratio. And when we have a 3-to-1 ratio, that's usually a good example of the law of dominance, which states that if a genotype has at least 1 dominant allele, it will show the dominant trait. And in this case, which trait is dominant? Is it the curly or is it the straight? Of course, it's going to be the curly to straight hair because that's what's matching our ratio here. So you're going to look in here and see what facts about inheritance you see for the dominant and recessive alleles for those hair types. Okay, in cattle, the allele for black-haired coat is dominant over the allele for a red-haired coat. What combination of parent alleles will produce all purebred black-haired offspring? So we have to remember a couple of things here. Purebred means homozygous. And we're also looking for black hair. So if it's homozygous and it's black, and black is dominant, we know that we're looking for homozygous dominant. So we're going to look at each of these options here, just like we did the other one where we set up a Punnett square for A, B, C, and D. You're going to draw out a Punnett square for each of those options, and you're going to figure out which one is going to make all homozygous dominant alleles. Now, you should be pretty good at Punnett squares by now, so if you're wise enough, you can probably look at each of these and very easily spot which one is going to create all homozygous dominant alleles. But if not, you can very easily just go through and write out each of those Punnett squares. Number 13, the diagram represents a Punnett square for Huntington's disease. What percentage of offspring will inherit Huntington's if it is carried on the dominant allele? So looking at this, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to fill out your Punnett square, and then you're going to say what percentage has the dominant trait for Huntington's disease, because it says that Huntington's is carried on a dominant allele. So we'll be looking for the percentage of dominant there. Number 14, Jackson's mother and father both have normal cells, a dominant trait. So normal is dominant, but Jackson has sickle cell anemia, which is a recessive trait. What is the genotype for sickle cell anemia represents each of Jackson's parents? So if we're looking at Jackson, we know that Jackson is showing sickle cell, which is recessive, which means that we know for sure that his genotype has to be homozygous recessive because otherwise he wouldn't have sickle cell. And we also know that he had to get one of those alleles from mom and he also got one of those recessive alleles from dad. But do dad and mom have sickle cell? No. It says that they have normal blood. So if they have normal blood and that's dominant, then what is their other allele here? Is it going to be a dominant allele or is it going to be a recessive allele? Number 15, examine the Punnett square. What percentage of the offspring should be purebred recessive? So first step is to fill out this Punnett square. Remember that we're always bringing one down and bringing the other one over. And then it's looking for purebred or homozygous recessive. So we're looking for our percentage of homozygous recessive there. Number 16, a researcher studies the inheritance of a particular trait in pigs to determine whether the type of ears, rigid or drooping, of offspring born to 3 pairs of pigs is an inherited trait. The table below shows the data collected. So we see that in 2 homozygous pigs, there were 18 offspring, and 18 of them had rigid ears. We have another issue where we have the 2 homozygous pigs where the number of offspring was the same for drooping ears. So this was homozygous rigid, and this is drooping. And then we have 2 heterozygous pigs in which we have more drooping ears than we did rigid ears. So which one is dominant? Is it drooping or is it rigid? And if you're not quite sure, we can also look at this ratio. This ratio is a 3-to-1 ratio. So what causes a 3-to-1 ratio? What would drooping be? Is it dominant or recessive, and what is rigid? Number 17, a farmer investigates how to produce more pea plants with round seeds. The table lists the phenotypes and genotypes of the pea plants that the farmer has. And it's asking us which type of plants should the farmer select to produce more offspring with round seeds. So we know that round is dominant, it says right here, because our round genotype is going to show that dominant phenotype. So round is dominant. So in order to show dominant, then we're going to have 2 of that, because plants 1 and 2, it doesn't matter how many times we breed them over and over again, the only possible outcome that we're going to get is still that recessive wrinkled pea, right? And we're wanting those round seeds, not the wrinkled seeds. So which of these reflects that we're going to need these heterozygous allele pairings? All right, so in cattle, the allele for black-haired coat is dominant over the allele for red-haired coat. And it says a cross between 2 cattle results in a calf with black hair. What is the possible genotype of the calf? So it doesn't really matter what the parent alleles are, because it's not asking about the parents, it's asking about the calf, right? So we're going to focus in on the calf. So we know that the calf has black hair. And we know that black hair, according to our problem up here, is dominant. So if it's dominant, we know that its genotype has to have at least 1 dominant allele. So it could have 2 dominant alleles. Excuse me, we're using B's, my bad. It could be 2 dominant alleles, or it could even have just 1 dominant allele and it'll still show up as that black hair color. But either way, the calf, the genotype for the calf, it has to have 2 alleles because it's diploid, right? Are these showing diploid counts or haploid counts? What about these? Which set can you eliminate? Once you've determined that, which allele shows that either of these could be the possible genotypes? The table provides information about 2 inherited traits in plants, stem height and flower color. Which genotype represents plants with short stems? So looking at this, we have tall stems are dominant, short stems are recessive. So if we're looking for a recessive trait, then we have to have 2 recessive alleles. And it's wanting us to use T's for that. So we have to have 2 recessive alleles for the genotype. The diagram shows a completed Punnett square for a trait represented by the letter G. What is the best description of the parents of this cross? So you're going to have to kind of work your Punnett square backwards on this one. If we have homozygous dominant, then we know that we got one of those alleles from one parent and the other allele came from the other parent. We know that for sure. We also have another homozygous dominant. We already established that this one was going to be a dominant allele, but that means also that it got its other dominant allele from this parent. Whereas over here, we see that this is heterozygous. Where did it get this dominant allele from? And where could it get this one from? So what you'll do after that is you'll look at your 2 parent genotypes and you'll match that to one of the answer choices below. Number 21, the Punnett square shows 4 combinations of alleles for black fur and white fur. Which genotype should replace the question mark? So the question mark is right here. I know it's kind of faded. And we have dominant and we have recessive here. So looking at this, if we bring down this allele and bring over that allele, then what genotype is going to go right there? Brown fur is dominant to white fur and rabbits. So we have that whole statement for our key. Which genotype would result from 2 parents that are homozygous for brown fur? So we're going to have to draw out our Punnett square. Homozygous, does that mean same or different? And if it's homozygous for same, and we know that brown fur is dominant, is it going to be homozygous dominant or will it be homozygous recessive? Okay, so once you've decided what your parent alleles are, you will put those on either side of the Punnett square. You will fill out everything in here and you'll say, okay, what genotype is going to result from those 2 parents? 23, what is the name of an organism's physical appearance? Remember, we said hetero is different, homo is same, so this is talking about your genotype, which are your alleles. So that leads us to these 2 right here. The table provides information about 2 inherited traits in plants: stem height and flower color. Which statement about these traits is true? So it's just asking some basic questions about the law of dominance. Remember that the law of dominance states that any dominant allele is going to completely mask the recessive allele in the phenotype. So read each of these statements and figure out which one is true in relation to this traits chart right here. Last one. In tomato plants, the trait for red fruit is dominant over the trait for yellow fruit. The table shows 5 possible crosses. Which cross represents possible parents of a tomato plant that has yellow fruit phenotype? So looking at representing the possible parents of a tomato plant that has yellow fruit phenotype. So is this yellow fruit, is that talking about the parents? Is that talking about the offspring? So here we're talking about the offspring. So which of these crosses is going to result in yellow offspring?